Really a homecoming for me. Let me introduce myself. I'm Kate Burke, and I'm president of the American Adoption Congress, so I'm not a mystery person. Coming back to Chicago is a very moving experience for me. 20 years ago, I was a young actress, and I arrived on the 6 a.m. flight on United Airlines with an Afghan hound and $400, and I was coming to make my mark in theater. And what this city taught me, I will never be able to repay. And I hope that while you're here, you draw on the strength of what Chicago has to offer. It's blue collar, elevated trains, downtown ballparks, big, strong skyscrapers. And it's a city where strength and rolling up your sleeves and getting to work means something. In the strength that Chicago offers, there's a small place where dreams are nurtured, and a supportive feeling that if you dream hard enough and believe hard enough and work hard enough, you'll get to where you need to be. And I think we from the adoption reform movement can learn from that. We have to believe, and we've got to find that power and strength, and we have to begin to build our own skyscraper. We started by laying the foundation with the March to Heal. The March to Heal was our cement base. We made a public statement, and we gathered our forces. We knew we weren't demonstrating to the right people, but we also knew that we needed to draw attention to our cause, and we knew that we needed to empower ourselves. And I remember as we were walking over, Robin will kill me, it's the Washington Bridge, I believe, in D.C., going to the Lincoln Memorial, stepping out from the line in my little shorts with my knobby knees flapping out there, and looking back. And as far as I could see, there we were, with our signs, walking proud. And what made me elated and brought tears to my eyes is, one, we'd done it, and two, the political statement we were making. We were laying the foundation for what was to come, and it worked. The press responded, the general public responded, and the inkling of an idea was sown that maybe the general public didn't think we were wackos. Maybe the general public thought, so what's the big deal with access to records? And in the past year, in radio call-in talk shows, too many to mention, that's the same perception I've gotten. We don't get negative calls. We get, how do I search? What do I do? So we laid the foundation with the March to Heal. And the second floor of our skyscraper was National Open My Records Day. Bringing it home, bringing it back to the grassroots, which is where we must go to be successful. And National Open My Records Day was a tremendous success. 30 some odd cities participated. Local press, whether 4 people showed up or 2 or 100, were there and supporting us. They'd say, well, I suppose we should find some opposition. Is there any? I can't imagine. So it was a success, and it also began to empower our local people. We need, at this point in time as a movement, to get political. We need to get outside of ourselves. This last year, California started legislative activity with the Triad Bill. And what I've learned from that, going 10,000 years to a university, never would have given me as much as I've learned in the last few years. We need to do things like go join our local parties and get active, support candidates, network in our own communities in a political way to become a political force. We have to form coalitions in our own states. We have to start getting a political machinery of the adoption reform movement in a state-by-state basis. We have to, in California, we had one Congress assemblywoman who was wavering. We were able, luckily, we have one of our biggest search and support groups in her district, to lay so much political pressure on her that we forced her to vote yes. That's what we need to do. We need to work for candidates, we need to endorse candidates, we need to become involved in politics. We sometimes become so ingrown. We have our search and support group, and there we are, and we have our local friends and what we do, and we talk about our issues. Well, now we got to get out of ourselves. We have to get out of ourselves. We've got to start getting the word out, getting political, supporting other causes. Implicit in that is that they will then support our causes. Because in political numbers comes strength. And in that strength comes power. And in that sort of organization comes the ability to achieve adoption reform. At the board meeting on Wednesday, we cut up the AAC. We had a wonderful time slashing it up and putting it back together. We are now going to be 7 regions, bigger regions. And in those regions, we're going to have state or provincial reps. And the jobs of those state reps will be to form those coalitions, will be to make choices with the coalition from that state of search and support groups and members, to make choices for that state. I mean, we really have to admit that North Dakota is not as developed in our movement as, let's say, California, or New York, or some of the East Coast states. So we need to allow each state to determine its own destiny, if you will. Maybe you're just ready to form a coalition to do education. Go for it. Maybe you're ready to try some little legislation. We want to get non-identifying information. Let's get our teeth, let's get our feet wet. But each state has to decide that for themselves. And the AAC will be there to back you up. We'll give you our resources, our help. But we must, and you can do it under the AAC umbrella with the backing of a national organization. We're really endeavoring to become politically smart. We also must instill in our own people the value of a political statement. Not everything has to be tied into search and support. Things like the New York Times ad, we were unable to get 1,000 people to participate. And I think one of the problems with that was that we yet don't understand as a movement what a political statement is. That was a political statement. And we're going to do it again. We will do it again. But we need to educate our own people when you go back to your search and support groups about what that is. Open Records is only halfway up our skyscraper. It's cleaning up. It's sweeping the floors so we have somewhere to go. Earlier in this conference I said, who better to solve the problems of adoption reform than those people who have lived it? We come to this movement not by choice, but we must stick around by choice. We come to this movement not because we choose to do so, but because we must do so. Well, we also must make sure that future generations don't endure the same indignities that we did. So once we achieve open records, we need to go forward and make sure that adoption reform takes place. Ken Watson and I have an ongoing thing about best interest of the child. Ken's theory and mine is that first we have to define what that is. My feeling is that if we operate adoption from what it's supposed to be, the best interest of the child, if we define what that is, it will be in the best interest of all parties involved. That's why the institution was supposedly created. And we must make sure that the reform we try to enact is not knee-jerk responses. I've been doing a lot of reading into the history of adoption. And it seems to me that the system that we now call an institution, that society, some of society deems to be so perfect, was created by knee-jerk reactions to specific needs, was not well thought out. We have to make sure that the changes that we want to have take place are not knee-jerk, that they're well thought out, that they're studied, and that they're humane and in the best interest of the child. But we must move forward. I've just created a task force in which the AAC will be creating a political platform on the state of adoption. And hopefully next year I'll be able to report back to you what that will be. It's time we accepted the responsibility that we bear. The AAC is trying its best to create the forum to achieve adoption reform. I ask for your support. I also ask, we lost Alabama this year. As of the 1st of next year, their records are sealed. The NCFA called it closing a loophole in the law. We knew it was happening, and we did the best we could. But you know why we couldn't fight it full force? We didn't have the money. And we're getting down to realities here. It's very frustrating to know what you must do and not have the financial wherewithal to do it. We can create some of that financial wherewithal. If you go back to your search and support groups and say, become an AAC member. What does the AAC do for me, says the little searcher on the street. We try and speak for you. We try and make the system be sensitive to your needs. We are not a search and support group. We're never going to be in that forum. We're never going to directly go to Joe adoptee or Mary birth mother or birth father or adoptive parent and do something hands-on for them. But we're going to do a lot for them in a larger sense, in a political statement kind of sense. We need membership. We need support. We need to be remembered at Christmas time. We can no longer lose another state. We're just beginning to cut our political eye teeth. And I'm saying we're just beginning the fight and we're already losing a state. That must never happen because we don't have the financial wherewithal to go in and fight. So I ask for your support. I also ask that we all make an effort to get along with each other. The adoption reform movement probably supports MCI and Sprint and AT&T. Much of it not with adoption reform. We need to work together because while we're squabbling, children are still being adopted under the old system of adoption. And while we're arguing points that don't mean diddly squat, babies are being sold. And not until we identify what's really important to ourselves and to each other as a movement, we're hurting children. We're hurting current adoptees and birth parents and adoptive parents. We must come together and speak out. We must come together and affect the changes that must happen. And we are the only ones who can do that. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to introduce to you Mary Ivonic from New Zealand. Mary was instrumental in the change of the New Zealand law, and I think we can learn a lot from her. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's indeed a pleasure for me to be here at this time, at this conference. I bring greetings to you from the Adoption Support Group movement in New Zealand, who have just finished their national conference the day before I left to come here. We are watching with interest the developments in the USA and in your struggle to get access to identifying information. And we hope that it won't be long before legislation will be introduced in each state which will enable to have people know who they are, etc. This is my third AAC conference, and I would really like to thank those who over the last 3 years, the last 4 years since my first attendance, have maintained contact and have kept me informed of their progress by sending some of their excellent newsletters that talks about the issues you're facing, the goals you've achieved, the things you're planning to do, the latest literature, which an isolated country like New Zealand doesn't always hear about. And I'm very grateful for those organisations who send me those details. But also help me to address and focus on some of the things which I know are going on at this present time. I think the theme of this conference is very timely chosen: winds of change, adoption in the new age. I believe as we are indeed entering a new age in adoption. Certainly in New Zealand, we hope the time won't be long that we won't be having any. The topic I have been able to asked to speak on today is, how did we open records in New Zealand? Some of you will have heard me talk about this before in Milwaukee or Calgary. However, having just completed a thesis for my Masters in Public Policy, which research covered the political process, had given me some new insight, new ideas which I hadn't quite been so clear about before. So I hope I'm adding to something you haven't heard before. Also, before continuing, I would like you to know I'm not a member of the Adoption Triad. I was asked yesterday by 3 people what license did I have to come and talk here and tell other people what to do. As I'm not a person who likes to give my CVs when I go to talks, as I find it very boring to hear a speaker being introduced for 20 minutes through all their achievements and then left 10 minutes to speak, I actually will give you some explanation of why I feel I'm in this particular work. I'm not in any way connected with adoption, neither is any member of my wider family. I am a professional social worker, not an activist. And as a professional social worker, the task required of my profession requires me as a social worker to be involved and promote social justice, relieve deprivation, prevent alienation, and work with the oppressed against the oppressors, promote mental health, etc., among other things. It takes away my license if I knowingly practice and become involved in work which is against social justice, encourages deprivation, alienation, promotes oppression, encourages measures that promote mental ill health, etc. So if you ask why I'm involved in this work, as a professional social worker, I have the obligation when I knowingly become aware of any of these factors. To me, there is no choice. Together we must work towards things, each their other role. I am not speaking on behalf of adoptees or for adoptees or birth parents or adoptive parents. However, I think as a professional social worker, I am assigned a role, and together we could work towards better goals. My involvement in the adoption area was not by choice, but at a direction of my agency's superiors, who gave me an ultimatum in 1974 to either take the job in adoption or leave. As I needed to work, and I remember Ken's words, if you don't stay in the organisation, you leave. However, as I needed to work, I reluctantly took on the job. I'm sure my agency directorates have regretted the day ever since. Personally, I practiced closed adoption for about 6 months. We were a very new team as the department had just reorganised, and the Department of Social Security, which provide financial aid, was joined with the Department of Child Welfare, becoming one large department of community social services. We had much to learn, as many of the social workers in my team came from the Social Security Department, where the whole focus was on advocacy for clients to ensure they had the entitlements for benefits. However, this was our lucky time, actually, because what it meant is together, when we worked in adoption and fostering and court work, we had to learn of what was the latest ideas on these things, because our social work training had been a few years previously. At that particular point in time, the debate in Britain was very actively about opening of records. The work of McWhinney and Tricia Lotus had been very influential in encouraging legislative change, together with its very strong political base by the person of Dr. David Owen. We sent away for the literature and followed it with great interest, comparing it what we were doing and told to do at that particular point in time. As we became aware that what we were doing did not really seem to bear out as what were the concerns expressed by groups in Britain, as well as by some of your prophets in New Zealand like Jean Payton, Florence Fisher, and some others. We examined our practice and looked at our act and asked ourselves, why did we have closed practices? And why could we not be more open, as it obviously had proven to be wrong in Britain and had detrimental effect? We discovered that our 1955 Adoption Act did not say that people were not allowed to know identifying information, only that access to records was not possible without a court order after the adoption order was made. This gave us the license, we felt, and the courage to initiate changes in our practice. And as we became more experienced and found the risks were paying off, that things were working okay, and saw the positive outcomes, we felt as professionals obliged, as we now knowingly had the information, to change things from being secret to open. We became actively engaged as advocates for change, both within the agency and outside in the community. We felt open adoption was something that at least could start as an interim measure while we could set our goals for a longer period of time to open records. After the passing of the Act in 1975, adult adoptees and birth parents and some adoptive parents became involved in organising adoption support groups in approximately 5 centres in New Zealand. They became organised and starting asking questions about the opening of adoption records and access to their original birth certificate. This particular period of time took 10 years, and the Adult Adoption Information Act was finally passed in 1985. I will briefly describe what our current act is before I go on and talk about the process. The Adult Adoption Information Act of 1985 was passed and became enacted in 1986. Now people say, we want an act like New Zealand. Let I warn you, it's not a perfect act. We have reviewed it and we like some changes, so please don't copy it. Learn from the mistakes and move on. The Adult Adoption Information Act gave access to identifying information for adopted adults at age of majority, which is age 20, and birth parents when their child has become 20. However, although it was generally recognised that information was a right, some members of Parliament were concerned and felt there was need of protection for those adopted people who had not been told, or for those people who would not wish to make contact. So we had to make a compromise and agree to have a veto system as part of the Act. Adopted people are able to place an endorsement on their original birth certificate, which prevents identifying information being given out. Birth parents are equally able to place an endorsement on their birth certificate, which equally prevents adopted people from receiving their original birth certificate. However, it doesn't guarantee that people cannot be found. We also found we had to accept the reality that following the British lines, the parliamentarians were not quite ready to allow access without some counselling being put in place. So we had to make the compromise that counselling was to be provided to any adult adopted person applying for their birth certificate. The reason being there was fear that young people would turn up on birth mother's doorstep and completely ruin their life, break their marriages and cause all sorts of disasters. And it would be really good if these young people had a good talking to by social workers before embarking on their case. It left it very open. And the Act stage, after having received counselling, the counsellor can issue the birth certificate. It does not allow for any other members of families to apply for information because of the veto system. If a birth mother places a veto or an adoptee places a veto, it did not feel appropriate to allow grandparents access to information or other people. So the result has been that the Act, many people who are not adopted people or birth parents have applied for information, and we have to turn them away, although we have started a de facto register. There are many things in the Act we would like changed, and later on I will go on talking a bit about where we're at now and what has happened since. However, it's really important to look at the process of how we came to be where we are, because I think it may be useful. In saying that, I would like to point out that the process of change is different depending on the climate in each particular country or state. So what worked in England, Australia, in Victoria, and New Zealand may have to be adjusted to the climate in the USA. However, I think on the whole, the process of change can go through the same stages. There are many things and lessons we learn as we progress. We certainly looked at the English legislation as a basis for ours. Victoria and Australia looked at our Act and improved on that. The New South Wales government, which has currently presented a report to Parliament, has used our experience and Victoria's improved on that, hopefully. And I hope that USA, by the time they get around to open records, will take all those things into consideration and therefore come up with a better thing as well. Ken Watson, in his keynote address, gave us an excellent framework in which to examine the nature of change, which we can use as a guide as we work through and build up our campaign and strategies. I advise you to go back and get the tape or get the paper, because looking at his framework, I could really identify clearly the process we have used and how well it fitted. It means that everyone has a guide to go by and it's easier to follow, and it doesn't look like an immense task. Particularly as someone said, oh, you only had to do it once in New Zealand, we had to do it 47 times. I disagree with that. Each one of you only have to do it once in your own state. So don't feel overwhelmed by 47 times doing the same thing, because if it looks too big, it prevents you from starting. So my advice to you is don't look at it as globally. You don't have to change the whole world. You only have to start by yourself in your own state. The other question in change is looking at the framework I find very useful. As Ken said, firstly, there are 3 levels of change. Changing the political structure, societal change, changing the systems and the organizations, institutional change, changing ourselves, personal change. He also stated that the 3 levels were not clearly defined, boundaries are blurred. Each of these 3 levels itself is again part of another system that is also part of a larger system, extremely important to keep in mind. Any change in one part of the system has an impact on the other and all the other interrelating system, which sometimes means you work at one level and it does spill over in the others and you don't have to do so much there, and you go backwards and forwards. You work a bit in one level, flow over to the other, and then you concentrate on this particular level, and it has these rippling effects. So I find that framework, and as he goes on, I highly recommend that people use it if they're really planning for change. It's not new. I think I teach these kind of things to my students in social policy, but it's really so clearly put together. We as a group and a movement, we started by personal change, and as Ken said very clearly, that we have to start with personal change, as institutional and political change start as the result of individual people making a decision that something is wrong and something needs to be done about it and something needs to change. When we applied it to ourselves as a professional, we and our team started to challenge and question our practice, saying, hey, that's going on and that's what's being said in England. This is what we're doing here. How come the difference? And sometimes it's different on your own. You really need to interact with other people because they're saying to you, because you think you're okay, you know, I'm okay. And it isn't until somebody points out saying, hey, you say you don't believe in that, but actually look what you're doing. You're telling me just when you went to this client yesterday, you told us such and such. That doesn't seem quite right. And there is these kind of debates which make you re-examine. As some of us inside talked about these, outside consumers grouped together to generally set up support groups. And I think the first 2 years in New Zealand, from 74, 75, was purely a period of time where people formed alliances very tentatively, very quietly, very secretly, because it actually took quite a lot of courage to come out of the closet and open up and talk about your pain with other people. And to do that, you need some time by yourselves. And I think the first 2 years of the groups were used for their own personal healing, by sharing their experiences, their pain with others of similar experiences. This way they could feel validated and slowly build up enough confidence, self-esteem, to actually have the courage to go beyond that. I guess from a social worker at that time, we reorganized again in our office, and I finished up being the specialist, which meant I became very isolated and worked on my own adoption most of the time. I therefore needed to go outside of my own office to go and sound out what were the concerns of consumer group. In New Zealand we have mixed group. Our support groups were all members of the triad. They also welcomed other people who had an interest. So from a social worker's point of view, it was easy to have entrance in those groups. I think there are times when each member of the triad needs to be together with their own. By having everyone together, it was quicker to be able to get to the nitty-gritty of people's personal prejudices and biases, because each member of the triad has been conditioned to believe certain myths and things about the other. So we all know that birth mothers are bad, we all know that adoptees or surrogates are mad, and we all know that adoptive parents are quite ugly people. So by actually having everybody together in the group and having face-to-face contact, and having to listen to each other's perspective helped much quicker to dispel some of these myths. And I think it sort of strengthened the cohesion. We had some real arguments and real battles, I can assure you. And being a social worker was not easy because people were so angry and hurt about the system, and to somebody there representing the system was a really good thing to vent your anger on. And for a professional, it was important for me to be clear. I wasn't personally responsible for that system. I inherited it. I feel bad about it, but I couldn't accept the guilt loaded onto me either. However, knowingly what was happening, I then had the responsibility to change. So being clear about yourself, starting on yourself, knowing what your biases and prejudices are, what your beliefs are, what your conviction then becomes, then goes on to the next step, to seek knowledge. Do your homework before you start arguing in public arenas and challenging people if you don't have the information. We made sure that we searched the literature very wide. One of the advantages of being so far away, you have to go outside yourself to get the information. Sometimes when you're big, you think it's all there and you forget to look beyond the boundaries. So I guess we were lucky that there was already places where things had started for change. We also looked at all the legislation. What happened over a 100-year period. New Zealand was the first country in the empire in 1881 who had an Adoption Act. We looked at the reasons of why are we having closed records, what was the rationale for it, who was demanding the closed records, what reasons were given, how relevant were the reasons then given today, who promoted the closeness, and also who was likely to gain most by promoting it. If you look at who is gaining most, it gives you some idea what you're dealing with if you want to undo it. What were the opposite views to it, and how relevant were they today? And by going through that process, we collected numerous pages of information. One of the Wellington Adoption Support Group, Keith Griffiths, who some of you had seen in Calgary talking with me, he literally has 24 volumes of about 400 pages in each, where every debate in Parliament over 100 years, every law, every legislation, every case in court, every public thing in the newspapers, it's all there. So reading all this stuff gave us a very clear picture of why do we have the things we have today. And there's nothing more convincing when you then start lobbying for change or educating the public to saying, well, the reason for this is here, look what it said. And you actually can show the paper. People can't disagree with the paper. They can disagree when you say something, oh, I don't believe you. How can you say that? Oh, I'm not too sure. But if you actually got it on black and white, it just strengthens your case so much. So doing that homework during that 2-year period before we even went outside has just proven to be so valuable. The other thing we had to develop was a capacity to take risk and experiment. I mean, once we are clear, we did have to take the next step and go outside. And that's very scary for members of the tribe, and I don't need to tell you all this, but for members of the tribe to have to go for the first time and write a letter to the editor or ring a radio talkback or agree to come to a prospective adoptive parent training program and stand up in front telling who you are and what your experience is an extremely scary experience. For a social worker who works in an environment which resists change, likes things to keep going as they are, as we heard, to raise somebody's practices is also pretty scary. So there are some things we did to help each other do that. So the first time people wrote together letters. You know, 3 of you can sit down and write a letter to the editor. If you're going to ring a talkback, make sure 3 people are available to back up your call so it's not just you. When we went and had birth mothers going to talk to prospective adoptive parents, 6 of them went, not 1. When adult adoptive people went, not 1 went, but 6. We thought 6 was a good number. We always aimed for 6. Don't ask me why, but that's what tended to happen. From a social work perspective, working inside an agency, it was very important to seek my allies within the agency. You cannot bring about change on your own. It's not possible. You will just be shot down and you'll lose your confidence, and that's the end of it. So I very carefully had to look at my allies within my colleagues, and it meant starting to talk on individual basis and saying to people, what do you think of this, etc., etc. Once you've got an ally, then look at the highest possible level you can get. I was very fortunate in my particular, the second agency I went to, I should say, not in the first one so much, but we had good support. In my second agency I worked on district agency, I got transferred, it's all the same department. My boss was an adoptive parent who had adopted a child at age 3, as well as having 2 of his own. And in those days, to actually adopt a special needs older child was a bit weird, you know. I mean, you didn't adopt older children then, it was then not acceptable. So he was a bit of an odd adoptive parent. And my immediate supervisor didn't really support these kind of things. She certainly didn't believe in it. But I had an ally higher up, so that made me be able to do some of the things. The seeking of knowledge also meant that we had to give reasons why we think things were the way they were. We had to build up arguments to counteract. So when people were saying, what about confidentiality? What about secrecy promised? We had to come up with these, and we developed standard answers to say to people, well, this was how it was. There was no secrecy promised. The records were open. It was just a practice, not the law. Lawyers covered, which is actually illegal. Some did, some don't. So they went beyond the law if they went and promised secrecy. And are you now asking to protect malpractice, etc., etc. So by being clear about that, it really helped go out. One of the things to remember is to build time in the process. Any personal change is different for each person. It's hard for all of us to change. We all resist change, and it takes continuing exposure over a period of time which make us move around. All of us find it hard to have to give up something. Like if we take on something new, we had to let something go. None of us like to lose things easily, and losing things always mean doing new things, which takes energy and needs effort, and sometimes it's easier not to do anything. So build time into your process, respect the integrity of the people you're working with. Don't start persecuting them if they don't move fast enough at your pace. There's nothing wrong with edging them along, nudge, nudge, but you know, the minute you start forcing things, you lose them. In terms then of the process, once having achieved enough personal change within ourselves, we then felt ready to tackle the institutional change and the political change. In institutional change, we work together, some of us within and some of them without, and how we can work together. Now, in New Zealand, the support groups, by working together, started going to the agency, asking for the non-identifying information as a first step. Information they were entitled to know. By presenting themselves to the agency became aware that the practices they had believed in the past were obviously not quite what they thought it was. Now, the initial response was rejection, send away, why do you want to know that, etc. But it's very difficult if you keep flooding the agency, and as Kent was saying, you don't beg, you demand, in a nice way. But you do be persistent, be assertive, be clear, because in the 2 years we worked, you were convinced you had the right to know. And once you have the conviction, it will give you the strength to keep going. So the agencies became flooded with requests for non-identifying information, which under the law they were entitled to give. So slowly it forced them to reassess the policy of that was not necessary. Unfortunately, many agencies did not have enough information, etc., the same as everywhere else in the world. But it then forced them to consider the current practice and saying, my goodness, it obviously means people need information. We better start changing our act and make sure we at least start to get information now onwards. So although half of the information was probably not there, the half what was there was half wrong, but at least it made sure that as the time went on, the information then taken from there on became correct or more correct. Consider changing the law, giving access to adult adopted people and their birth parents. The government responded by saying no, they had no intention, they hadn't thought about it. Maybe at some stage in the future this would come up, but no immediate changes were planned. The immediate response from head office in my department was a letter to all adoption workers saying, there has been an increase of inquiries for non-identifying information and identifying information. To make sure that we do not break our promises made to the past to adoptive parents, all social workers are instructed not to reveal any confidential information and not to do anything which undermines the parental role of adoptive parents. If an adopted person presents themselves to the agency at age 40 or 45 and asks, can you tell me if I'm adopted? I have this feeling I'm adopted. I've asked my parents and they said no, but I'm not sure. Is there anything you can help me with? We had to say, well, no, we're not able to tell you that. Go back to your parents. If somebody came and said, I would like the non-identifying information, they had to have the permission of the adoptive parents in writing. 40, 50-year-old adoptees, having 80-year-old parents, coming with a letter. It even stated in very clear writing, if the adoptive parents, if an adoptive person comes and says to you, have my adoptive parents told me my birth mother's died at childbirth and my father died of a car accident 2 days later, can you tell me if that's true? And if it was not true, we couldn't say that's not true. We had to reinforce what the adoptive parents had said. So the instruction from my head office to me was I had to lie to my clients in front of me. I guess for me that was the impetus to then say, this is it. And got then very actively involved outside lobbying, making submissions as a private individual, which every citizen has the right to do. I think for agency workers, it is always possible to work outside your agency. Everyone is allowed to work for Rotary, for Lions. Why not for adoption support? I mean, you have that right, and I want you to claim that right as professionals if you believe that your professional responsibility is to fight against oppression and so on. Feel that you have the right to do that. Because if not as an agency worker, you have the right as a private citizen. So as time went along, the next question in the House was asked the following year by another Member of Parliament, is the government this year intending to have legislation put in place? The government responding again, well, they have thought about it and maybe next year they would have time to consider this. The next question was asked, how many people has the Department of Social Welfare had come back for identifying information? The response from head office was only about 42 throughout the country. Now, I worked in an agency, I know what I was seeing, I know who was coming back. it's very difficult to speak out against your minister or your agency. So the next step for me was I set up a little research project and asked all the intake workers, any phone call, any person coming in asking for identifying information, channel them to me. Make sure you don't answer. I noted all those in over a 6-month period and finished up with having 242 inquiries in the one district. Now, because it's confidential information agency stuff, how to get this to the support groups and how can professionals and support groups outside work together. I suggested to my support group that they organise a public forum and ask me as a speaker, which they did. I then asked my agency staff, could I, my boss, I've done this research, is it okay if I share this with the public? Yeah, sure. He was on my side, he was an adoptive parent. So at the public forum I presented these numbers, which gave then the group license to go back to Parliament and saying, this is what you said, this is what she said, what is going on? It meant the department then had to force and ask other district officers to keep records of inquiries, what is going on. So this is how professionals and groups can work together, each in their own sphere, in their own area, but together supporting each other as we go along. So by 1978, another member of Parliament said, last year you promised that you were thinking of introducing legislation. Are you now introducing legislation this year? If not, I give notice that I will introduce a private members bill in the next session if you are not going to. It took 2 years to find a member of Parliament who was prepared to make a commitment to see the issues through to the end. Several members had been tried, but this particular one. Now, the framework says you go to the highest power as you can. Unfortunately for us, the only one we could get was a backbencher of the opposition. However, the purpose was to raise the issue, not necessarily thinking we would get an act, but by actually introducing a private members bill, you then often force the government to take it over or to proceed with it or whatever. So these are strategies you use. You don't expect it to succeed. It is just another way of working. I'm sure that you have a similar system. They have it in Britain, they have it in Australia, they have it here. We also make sure that the masses of the adoption support group can participate by, if Mr. Hunt raised it in the question in the House, that all of us got on the phone and rang our own MP and say, oh, Mr. Hunt is doing this wonderful thing, I really think you should support him, I think what he's doing is right. We made sure that we wrote to the Prime Minister, the Minister of Justice, saying, what are you going to do about the question Mr. Hunt raised? This is my story. We encourage members of our support groups to make individual appointments with their own electorate representatives and tell them their story, write letters, and so on. This is when some of people were more actively involved with lobbying. We made appointments. Being inside the department, I couldn't actually at that stage go and see members of Parliament because as a public service you're supposed to be neutral. So the thing I could do is help other people build up enough confidence, self-esteem, build them up and send them on their way, and build them up afterwards if they had a bad reception. So I think these again we can work in together. It's in their role. As the time proceeded, a private members bill was introduced in 78 at the end, and after an initial debate it was voted by majority that it was not allowed to proceed for a select committee hearing, and it was thrown out. Some of the reasons was really very clear. They were talking about breaking up families, children, etc. The age was then 16. The next year, the redrafting of the bill, we raised the age to 20 as the age of majority in New Zealand. That got a lot more support. So you had to make this sort of, you test out the waters, you look at the response you get, and then you evaluate and what adjustments do we need to make. So as a result, we raised the age from 16 to 20. And we built in a 2-year veto for either party. This got more support, but still people were concerned and the government was not prepared to let it proceed. By this time we got to 1980 and he introduced the bill again, making again some minor adjustments. By this stage we had ensured the media had full coverage, and made it sound that government was not proceeding with allowing a democratic process. We kept arguing then, look, we know we may not get this bill through. All we are really asking for the democratic process to take place. So if you're really democratic, this bill should go to a select committee, and if there is no support, well, we will accept that. But at least we should allow our fair, honest chance. And this is the argument we took. The government by then had quite a lot of criticism from the media for not allowing this to proceed. The government then sent it to a select committee. I'm sure they quite thought that would be the end of it, that there would be a lot of opposition. By that time, the support groups had become very organized and strong and stable in the 5 main centers. We had no organized opposition because people hadn't really got themselves organized. We had 95% of all the submissions in favor. There was something like 168 submissions, and it was the biggest lot of submissions ever received on a private member's bill, with 95% in favor. So this was quite a surprise. The committee did feel there were flaws in the proposal, and they redrafted a bill according to the submissions made. And it did mean that compulsory counselling was recommended for those adopted people. They also did not agree with the same procedure for adopted people and birth parents. Adopted people, after having received counselling, they can get their birth certificates, go on their way and do their own search, mediation, or not search, or whatever. Birth parents have to apply to the Department of Social Welfare. The department search on behalf of the birth parent if there is no veto on it, make contact with the adult adopted person, and if they agree, then they can get together. So there was a compulsory mediation for birth parents, but not for adopted people. We also had the veto system for then a 10-year period and renewal after 10 years, but it could be taken off at any time. So the 2 years we had consented to was proposed as being 10 years and renewable, as we had said 2 years, and that's the end of it. We then had to make a decision. The opposition then became organised and put in another proposal for a pure registry and nothing else, a contact register by mutual consent. We felt this really wasn't very acceptable because we really believed if the registry was gaining power, we would not want to proceed with the bill and withdraw it. As Ken said, we had to decide what is the bottom line. Where do you compromise on and where do you don't compromise on? Now, we knew we would never get it in at 16, but starting off by 16, unions are very good at building in compromises, which you then take out and you still finish off with more or less getting what you want. We knew we would never get 16. We never knew we would not get compulsory counselling. But by starting with that, and then build on it, it looked that we were more reasonable, more open to suggestion, change, and knowing that the ultimate goal will probably be 20. We knew we would have vetoes. We were scared that we might have permanent vetoes, like in Victoria, so that they could be put on once and last forever, unless people want to take it off, but not having to renew it. And we thought by having to at least renew it every 10 years, by that time, 10 years ahead, people will be so educated they wouldn't want to renew it. We also knew from the research maybe up to 5% of birth mothers may wish to place a veto and only about 2% of adopted people. We also knew with our expertise in searching under closed records, we would be able to help most people who had a veto to find out anyway, quite legally, because the veto did not say you're not allowed to search. The veto only said the Register General of Birth and Death and Marriages cannot give you birth certificate with identifying information. And in our pamphlet, which we drew up with the implementation, we made it clear, placing a veto does not mean you can never be found. So be prepared. And it was a reality. We didn't want to create another myth. If you place a veto, you're safe, don't worry, dear, because it's not true. So we didn't want to create another myth and be very clear about it. So building compromises in your demands so you can change if you need to, which then you're more likely to get some of or most of what you want. In the meantime, we got extremely discouraged by the opposition. When it looked that when the House of Representatives, the Select Committee reported back, it was very clear that it had a majority vote in the House. A straw poll by the Private Members Bill, by that states the MP, showed very clearly that 2/3 of the MP of the House had committed themselves to voting for this measure after those adjustments. Therefore, he was trying to press on to get it to a vote. The Prime Minister of New Zealand then, who personally was very opposed, and he is in charge of the order paper of issues to be discussed, we believe was personally responsible, and he has claimed to be responsible, for then not allowing the next stage of the democratic process to take place by having the second reading of the bill and the report of the Select Committee to be discussed by members of the House. By that stage, and because it was a free vote, it's a value issue. It's not an economic policy of government. It's a value issue, so they have a free, conscious vote. So the normal party political machinery does not work, which is very scary for a lot of MPs because they are personally held accountable by the electorate on how they vote, which they can't hide saying, well, you know, I have to vote with my party or whatever. They can't hide under that. So on the whole, MPs were a bit nervous because there is no vote gains for them, and the purpose of MPs is to stay in Parliament. And so by, you know, having this vote, for every vote for, they will lose one on the other side. So there was no personal electoral gain for members of Parliament. So as support group people, as lobbyists, how can we then get the support of members to support this if there is no electoral gain for them? And we decided that the only way to do that was to play on their emotions, really, and presenting it to them in a way that made it very difficult for them to refuse this issue. And we really talked about, you know, what is desirable in a society: openness, honesty, truthfulness, compassion, humanness. Are these things we should aim for as a society, or as a society should we aim for secrecy, denial, hidden things, oppression? Are these the things MPs should be promoting? What do you think, we would ask? And I mean, they can't really say anything else but, well, of course, openness is better than close and secret and oppression. So these kind of tactics we use because unless they could be personally convinced and feel uncomfortable about it, you had to get them to be uncomfortable enough to want to do something. And the next thing was people kept telling their personal stories. And that was only weapons we really had. And it was these things that eventually we believe caused the thing to pass and get support. However, despite the support, again, the opposition used every trick in the book of the parliamentary process to prevent this bill legally from coming to the top. Now, private members' bill of oppositions are traditionally always thrown out. I mean, no government in power allows things to proceed. It's usually a tactic used. Our bill had come further than most. And making it a conscious issue meant it had more likely chance to proceed. However, there are many other proper legal ways of stopping it. So what actually happens with a private member's bill at the end of the year, if it hasn't had a chance to be debated, it usually lapses. And the government presents a list which says, these bill, I move that these bills are not carried over, and I move that these bills are carried over. So by the end of '81, the bill of the Adult Adoption Information Bill was on the list, not to proceed to the next stage. By that stage, it had been to a select committee. Many people had made investments and commitments to it. So a real uproar came by the opposition by saying, look, members of the public have made these submissions. You are undermining a democratic process here. At least let it go to a vote or go to the next session for the following year. Members of the government who also were concerned about this, although they were opposed to the measure, still voted for it to proceed because of the democratic process. They didn't want to be seen undermining democratic process. So despite the movement by the Prime Minister and the leader of the House, who is in charge of all the papers as well, it then was voted to be carried over to 1982. We got a promise from government they would debate it in the first session. By the end of the first session, it hadn't arrived. Questions were asked. We rang our MPs, we sent letters, we got the media. When is this being debated? As it came near the top of the order paper, the government moved that precedents had to be set for urgent matters in the House, and as the session was running to an end, no time was available for private members' bills, and back it went. This went on again to the end of the year, when it came in 82 to be carried over. Jonathan Hunt asked, will the bill be carried over? And they said, yes, it would. At the last minute, a half an hour before the session closed, it was moved that the Adult Adoption Information Act would not be carried over. Again, an uproar went out, and again, government members, even they were opposed, voted for it to be carried on. And so we were in 83. And just, this process just carried on and carried on. All of a sudden in 83, the Prime Minister, who is a very pro-life person or pro-anti-abortion person, moved an urgent debate on an abortion bill. So this was used by saying, if you've got time for an abortion bill, you've got time for the adoption bill. And so all of a sudden, 2 weeks later, the second reading and the reporting back and the second reading was allowed to proceed. It had 2/3 of the vote to then go on to the committee stages in the final reading. We really thought we got it now, finally. The end of the year emerged and nothing happens. And again, by the end of 83, it was moved that it should not be proceeded to the next session. Again, by that time, members of the government became very publicly embarrassed by this obviously control by few people in cabinet not allow this bill to proceed. And we used every media within our power, and we were gaining a lot of support, even from people who were basically opposed. But as Ken was saying, sometimes the issue becomes irrelevant. They'll vote for it because they didn't want to be seen as members of parliament to be autocratic and be authoritarian and not be democratic. So that then became the issue of some of the government backbenchers with their own leadership for being seen to prevent justice from taking place. So we got, for that reason, support, nothing to do with the issue. Which was interesting. So finally in 84, they were still managing to not debate it. And we had a snap election in the middle of 84, and we had to change the government. Now, when the Labour government came in power, the first thing we did was introduce a new bill, because a new government, everything lapses, so we have to start again. By that time, the opposition, being now in opposition, who were previous to government, they became very organised to fight the bill all the way. And so we had the ex-Prime Minister appear before the Select Committee, which he had never done in his life as a Member of Parliament. We had the Minister of Justice opposing it, and all these people became very organised. And they had connections with the media, and so they got a lot of publicity and increasing the fear, the Pandora box. This is the cruelest of bill to these poor women. What about we must protect the birth mothers, and all those sorts of things. So they became very heated, but the Labour government had said this bill was going to proceed right through for a democratic process. By that time, they knew they had 2/3 of the vote. And for us outside, we then got really scared because the Labour people were sick and tired of keep arguing in Parliament about this bill. They had made up their mind and they couldn't be bothered responding, but the opposition kept raising it. And we didn't hear the other crying. We were thinking, oh my God, we're losing grounds. 13 people spoke on the topic yesterday and only 2 spoke in favour and 11 or 12 against. What does this mean? And we really panicked. And the most opposition was just no random research, all you've got is anecdotal and all these activists and they are biased and prejudiced, we mustn't take any notice, and the fears of what we would do to birth parents if these children were now coming back from the past. Birth parents then became very active, and none of them spoke out against it in terms of submissions or letters to the editors. But one woman stood up and said she represented Birth Parents Anonymous, and she had 2,500 letters, but because they were anonymous, they couldn't show any of them. And she appeared before the select committee saying, I'm not a birth mother, I'm an ex-nurse, and I'm concerned about all these promises made to these birth mothers who were as a result of rape and incest and all these horrible things, like as if that was all the time happening, and who had written to her, 2,500 of them, who all wanted to remain secret because they couldn't possibly come forward. And the select committee were really brilliant, and they said, well, unless you can show us some, we really can't take your word for it. I mean, what do you want us to do? So they were the only ones who spoke out against it. Finally, it went through the second reading, and in our last panic, we sort of brought out Paul Sutcliffe from Canada, who had done the random research. He had selected tables. I must say now I've read his book, I shudder. But that's beside the point. At that time, we had selected tables presented which seemed to indicate that birth mothers were not afraid of being contacted and that adopted people were not afraid of being contacted. And that's all we really needed, and that supported our idea. And then the bill went through and we had this 2/3 majority, and we're saying, oh, that's what it did. But actually, since 1981, we had 2/3 of the vote in the House in favour. But because of a very strong political, powerful unit, it was prevented from taking its democratic process. And so all I can say is, if you're going to try for legislative change, try for the most powerful person, because if you don't, you're bound to lose. You're going through a hell of a lot of energy, anger, pain, resentment, you name it. And the energy just, trying for 8 years to maintain a campaign actively through Parliament, on and off. Now, I wasn't personally affected, so my emotions were probably more in control, and I think that's where maybe I could offer the most, because although I was so damn angry and frustrated, at least I personally wasn't prevented from my access to information. So I think, my role probably at that time was support, keep on doing, keep on giving, building up esteem, because that's all I could do. And so that we have a role, we can do things. Those who are less traumatized can support those who are through a campaign which is not easy. It takes determination, it takes effort, it takes doing your homework, it makes compromises, but there is a bottom line. And no way we were prepared to accept a register. We were not prepared to give up on birth mothers, and we would have been able to get just access for adoptees without vetoes, but we said no, we must have birth parents. We would have withdrawn the bill. So there are certain bottom lines which we would not be willing to compromise on. Now maybe your bottom line might be different. For me professionally, having now come along on the way, I think I've reached the stage that I can no longer support compulsory counselling, or certainly not compulsory mediation. And so there is nothing I could ethically say that it would be right. I mean, this is what I now have for 4 years after the Act is in place. There is no justification. I see time is getting on. I will move on what has happened since. I did spend this time because I just want you to know that things are not easy, they are hard, but it's possible, and only you can do it. Having gone along the way 3 years later, part of my thesis for a public policy was to interview members of Parliament 3 years later Why was it the way they voted the way they did? What actually made them change their mind? And there was no doubt of all the processes. There were 5 things as I lined them up. And the most important convincing thing to get the MPs on their side was the personal stories of the members of the triad. So you have the tools to change than anyone else, and don't let anyone else do it for you, because no one can tell your story as it is for you. So I think that for them, they said, most of them, they were not involved with adoption, they didn't know anything about it, and they just were part of the normal prejudices in society. And it was the personal interviews individuals made to members in their electorate, telling them how it was, their pain, their grief, or their joys, or whatever. Sometimes they would go with their parents or birth father or whatever, adopted people, adoptive parents, broad range of the people, but it was the individual contacts who were made. Secondly, it was the individual letters. There was a real reluctance from our MPs to look at standardised letters who were all the same. They tend to finish up in a rubbish bin from their perspective. That's what they told me. So it was the personal letters. Thirdly, the members who had had personal experience because of their own friends or extended families had influenced them to think and support it. So it's those you have to keep in mind as well. Fourthly, many were really surprised about the use of we used the literature to point out the reasons we concentrated, why did we have the closed system we had. Now we all know when we've looked at the history, the whole issue of closed adoption is the most ludicrous, ridiculous nonsense we have ever heard. You know, it was purely speculative fantasies based on studies with goslings bonding to other human beings 2 days after birth or something. And so bonding took place after birth. Mothers could therefore forget about their children. And we know that adoptive parents could bond with the child as if it was their own. And it was just as good as having your own because bonding only took place after birth. I mean, all this speculative kind of theorizing. And that, you know, mothers could have a 9-month pregnancy and actually forget. I mean, the logic is absolutely ridiculous. And I keep pointing that out. And people just saying, God, did we really believe this? You know, I mean, and the whole thing is really a huge experiment based on no foundations, which are solid. And we just should do away with it. So that was the other thing that really helped them. And fifthly, it was the kind of research of the after of reunions. So research of outcomes of reunions and so on was interesting to them, but by the time they read them, they'd already convinced because of what they'd seen of individuals. So that was the most important thing. So as workers in a movement, I suggest that you use your power, you use your tools, because it's the most effective weapon for change. In terms of our what has happened since the Act, and I have written in this report, I surveyed all the independent counsellors and staff who had to do the compulsory counselling under the Act. And again, I like to know, once the Act is passed, we thought the world would, you know, everything would be finished. It's only the beginning. Everything usually gets botched up with implementation if you have a good Act even. It's really very often because you get discretionary interpretation and how things are done. A good example is Victoria. I suggest you study the process in Victoria, which had a better Act than New Zealand, but in the implementation finished up with an 11-year waiting list for your original birth certificate. New Zealand, we had a very open thing, but because we were able to control it centrally, and I was seconded to do the implementation of the Act after it was passed, because our department had to post the Act. And all of a sudden, in 85, it was passed, and I said, my God, what are we going to do? And I said, look, I'm really happy to help you out. And so I was very lucky to be able to be part of implementation. There were only 2 of us, one a head office person, and she did all the sort of getting office space and cars and telephones and all that sort of thing, and I dealt with the procedures and the whatever else, training. So the implementation is the next step. So if you think of support groups, once you've reached the goal of getting the act, that is the end, you can disappear, you can do nothing, forget it. You have to start with watching very carefully how then things are interpreted. Now in our act it said after having received counselling from the counsellor you can get your birth certificate. It didn't say what counselling, what for, how long for, how many sessions, by whom, nothing. So the implementer had the choice to decide what kind of policy and practices. Now in New Zealand I was able to say to my superior, well look, this new government is in for public consultation. So we have to go to the groups, consult with them what they want for their counselling. The groups defined, and I think I've said it in Calgary, I went with my boss who had never been to a support group, hadn't really much to do with birth parents, adopted people. I was quite scared of what sort of people he was going to come across. The first meeting were hand-picked people with people I've known for years. We had this lovely meeting starting with port at the door and lovely meal and having lots of praises for my boss and saying, gosh, this is wonderful, we've never been consulted before, I'm really grateful, this is what you're doing, I think this is wonderful. And we then proceeded, how do you think the counselling should take place? And we're saying, well, it should not be therapy. We need information, not therapy. We need support. We don't need medication or whatever else. And then the next step was, well, if this is what the counselling should be, information, support, what sort of people are best to give this sort of service? Well, if you don't want therapy, you don't appoint therapists. If you need information on searching, then you appoint people who know how to do this. If you need people to support, you want people who know how to support in these situations, and who better than the clients who've done it before. We have incest survivors group, we have rape crisis things, which are all AA or all ex-alcoholics, etc. So we then proceeded with the ideal appointee was this, this and this. Secondly, the search process, etc., it was all clearly defined by the group. This way we got support from the group to help the departments work. They set up support groups, the workers went to the support group and vice versa, and together we never had a waiting list longer than 3 weeks for a birth certificate, about 4 months for a birth mother, except in the first 3 months when you sort of got this load. Having gone back now, 13,886 people have made use under the Act, but in terms of certain age group, when I compared it with the 25 to 35 age group, which is the bulk of the applicants, and compare them with the adoption order maids in that period of time, over 50% of those in that age group have applied. So and this is only within the first 3 years and 6 months. So the argument that very few people need to know this, that it's only a very small minority, is no longer valid if one takes into account that many people have already made contact prior to the Act. Myself personally have been involved with over 2,000 reunions between 75 and 85. Because I was an agency worker, I recorded everyone I had an involvement with to cover myself. And so therefore, it's really important. Lastly now, where do we go for the future? And one of the things in this conference which has really concerned me is the fact that we still have people talking about adoption, new infants, 12 months wait. What is your bottom line? Do we as an organization still facilitate these people here? If you are not clear of your goals, if you don't know where you want to go for the future, why are you asking people? I was just so mad yesterday, I could just scream. These people are now advertising in New Zealand for promoting surrogate parenthood and these kind of services. We have now as a group moved to the States, where our last conference last week was saying adoption is no longer an option. What we need to concentrate on is the preservation of families. Our Children and Young Persons Act legislation last year gave legal status to the preservation of families. We are no longer allowed to remove children outside of the family unit without consultation of a family group. And our process is that first, if a mother and child or parents and children cannot work together, we are legally obliged to call an extended family group conference. This family group conference is giving all the information what the problem is. They are asked to come up with a solution. We remove ourselves from the room while they debate. They inform us what they want. They inform us where this child should go. They inform us of the resources we have, and we have the financial background to support it. Families are paid to look after their own children if they need it. We have paid foster parents to strangers for years. We have moved paying kinship to keep families. We are now saying adoption is no longer an option. We want this process of caring for children the same in cases of single pregnant women. There was a general consensus of the conference that that is where we move. If we believe in the sanctity of the family is the family of origin. And this is where we must move. And if this process is taken into place, very few adoptions should ever take place. Infertility is a separate issue, nothing to do with adoption. We must concentrate in giving services to infertile couples to solve their infertility, medical research, prevention, you name it. It's separate from adoption. That's where we are. I've well gone over time, as I always do. I wish you well.